As the trend is in America, smaller towns are dying. As the population gets older, they need medical services and so forth. And thus the population leaves, the towns decline, tax base is gone, buildings deteriorate.
You can look at every situation in South Dakota and you can see how those two steel rails have gone through it and how they've influenced it. It's hard to separate the two. South Dakota's history from railroading, there's just no way to divide them up.
The history in this area is very, very rich. There's a lot of stuff that goes unsaid. We're kind of the forgotten part of the state. There's not necessarily anything to see. It's all written and oral history that we have out here. You can go out and you can stand in the middle of the prairie when the wind's blowing and watch the grass blow in the wind, but as far as sights to see and monuments to see, there really aren't anything. It's just it's the oral history and the written history that we have to offer.
Settlers of the Great Plains had big dreams. Dreams of money, dreams of new lives for their families, and dreams of new freedom. Their ambitions, as well as the Homestead Act, railroad expansion, and farming advances led them to the Great Plains and the Black Hills.
They weren't platted out towns, but they were in a community area where you would have a grouping of probably 100 homesteaders in an area. Most of them are ghost towns, and some of them are fading from people's memory, but you get into places like Miskel that weren't ever very popular, or even Lightcap. They were more spots in the road. Those places are slowly fading from people's memory, especially with the younger generation that don't particularly know their local history as much as, or what the grandparents have told them. There might be just a little divot in the prairie of once a homestead was or where a building was, and Mother Nature has reclaimed itself.
The territory that would become South Dakota was added to the United States in 1803 as part of the Louisiana Purchase. Passed by Congress in 1862, the Homestead Act gave settlers 160 acres of farmland with the requirement to homestead the land for 5 years. Many scouted then selected their homesteads in the fall, returning home to wait out the winter. Others staked out their claim and blazed forward with courage and determination, discovering the harsh reality of starting from zero in a land filled with unforgiving weather, but endless possibilities for those who survived. As settlers built up their farms, they also built up small villages and towns that supplied the staples and society they needed. Ordway was one of those communities, named after Nehemiah G. Ordway, who served as governor of the Dakota Territory from 1880 to 1884.
Ordway was started back in 1881. The town was also the very last town along the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad tracks. So it was kind of in a sweet spot. It had hoped to be two things, either the territorial capital or the home for a really large Methodist university. Unfortunately, neither one of those happened. The territorial capital went to Bismarck, and the Methodist University ended up going to Mitchell. Ordway had in its day a hotel, a blacksmith shop, a general store, some other stores, attorneys. They were no longer the end of the line for the railroad. The railroad went on to the next town of Columbia. Things just started going downhill for them.
Today, Ordway has only farmland with a few homes in the area. Texastown sat on the Missouri River and was known for the services it provided to steamboats hauling goods up and down the mighty Mo. Texastown was short-lived. Founded in the mid-1860s, it had already disappeared by the 1870s. According to fragmented reports gathered by the Union County Historical Society, Texastown had a hotel and a few other businesses. The origin of its name may come from the former African American slaves who made their way up the Missouri River during and after the Civil War. Steamboats docked at Texastown, tying up to big cottonwoods on the riverbank. The town sawmill furnished lumber for buildings in Elk Point, some 6 miles away. But the introduction of the railroad in Elk Point in 1873 led to the demise of Texastown. All that remains today is the town cemetery. Many of the graves have no markings, and the number of folks laid to rest there is uncertain.
My first name is Erna, and in German it's pronounced Erna. Ich kann Deutsch sprechen. I can speak German.
Like many who settled in Albee, South Dakota, Erna Cahill descended from German immigrants. Located in Grant County, Albee was incorporated in 1902 and named after W.C. Albee, a railroad dispatcher. Erna moved to Albee after marrying her husband, James Cahill. She has fond memories of her early days in Albee and the story she was told of this once booming town.
I didn't especially like our farming. And I had to have told James that I would not work on a farm. He agreed that his mother had never worked in the fields or anything, but she did gardening. I followed the same pattern. And bless his heart, he handed the checkbook over to me. James's mother said Albee was a real up-and-coming town before my time, but it had fallen by the wayside. When I came there were 3 elevators and there were 3 hardware stores, and so that was quite a town. My mother-in-law told me that if you wanted to buy Christmas presents, you didn't have to go to Millbank to buy them. You could buy it right in Albee. It was a small railroad town. And you know what has become of those little towns along a defunct railroad.
It was established in 1880. It was the biggest town in the county in its day. It had about 200 residents. They had grocery stores, they had a school, 2 churches, Lutheran and then a Methodist, and livery stables and jewelry store and millinery store and an elevator, of course, which the town depended upon. The Depression came along. There was no crop, and if there was no price. Towns just had to close up. They either moved buildings and took their businesses to Redfield or Tulare. And then again, after the Depression, it came back to life again and kind of rebuilt in the 1900s, or then it disappeared.
Crandon was named after Frank P. Crandon, a railroad official, which was common for many of the towns that popped up in the late 1800s. The post office was shut down in 1935. Today, a small cemetery overlooks a few remaining houses and some pasture land.
The railroad was a major influence in South Dakota for so many places. Where the route of the railroad was going to be actually made or broke many a town. The railroad companies themselves had wholly owned subsidiaries, land companies, which created a lot of towns. They platted them and sold lots, an additional source of income for the railroad company. And they did that all throughout South Dakota. About every 7 miles you had to have a town because of the steam locomotives needing water and so forth. And that's how quite a number of towns were created in South Dakota by the railroad, which later destroyed the concept when they pulled the railroad lines out.
The first railroad in South Dakota was actually the Winona and St. Peter Railroad, which was a predecessor of the Chicago and Northwestern, and they laid their first tracks into what was called Headquarters, South Dakota, which later became the town of Gary. and that was in the fall of 1872. The railroads built towns along their right-of-ways every 7 to 10 miles, depending upon the geography, simply so that they could establish communities, but also that they would have servicing facilities for their locomotives. There were a lot of smaller communities already being developed ahead of the railroads. Now, you get out into the central and western part of the state, the railroads actually had town site companies that were subsidiaries of their company going ahead of the railroads and developing communities ahead of the tracks.
The Chicago and Northwestern Railway Company crossed paths with the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha Railway in Elrod, South Dakota. Established in 1883, it was originally called Ida, then later renamed to Elrod after former South Dakota Governor Samuel H. Elrod. It was a town on the brink of expansion with close to 200 people calling it home.
I was born and raised here in 1948. Started in the first grade, and no kindergarten in those days. In my time, there was the school here, obviously, and then the store, which is north here about a block and a half. They would have been the buildings of the hotel and probably a harness shop. And I still remember walking home, and we would walk the railroad rails and balance on them, which would have. And at that time, we still had a steam engine going through here, so we would lay pennies once in a while and nails on the track, and then they'd flatten them out, and then we'd walk back and get them. And I still think that Elrod would have been a real mega for the railroads, because they had two major line railroads going through it, and what Dwayne's dad would always refer to as the Y, where the two intersected.
They would switch the lines when the train come. There was a person that did that, and if it switched to go on the Northwestern, they'd go that way, otherwise they'd go north. And then they kept the rail up fairly well, you know. There was crews that come along, and I remember my dad calling them service cars, and they had like a teeter-totter almost. They had to pump it. That's how they went back and forth, and they would build fence and different things like that, keep the railroad up along there.
Once the railroads pulled out, so too did the people.
Smithwick's got its name from a surveyor that was surveying the railroad. When they made the town Smithwick, they had an S on the end, and Smithwick's, and then of course they changed it back to Smithwick. It was Fred Smithwick that surveyed the railroad through Smithwick. We had 6 sets of grandparents that lived in Fall River County. 5 of them lived in Smithwick at one time or another.
Siblings Frank Ferguson and Deanne Reeser's great-grandfather homesteaded in Smithwick, South Dakota, located in Fall River County. This railroad community was also known as a cattle town that supplied livestock to Sioux City and Omaha.
They came in covered wagon and stopped there at Smithwick. He dug a hole about a foot deep, and water came, and he said, "This is where we're going to stay." So they stayed there and homesteaded, and there was nobody around except cattlemen. Well, it was a pretty good sized town at one time. They had 3 lumber yards there, and they had 1 grocery store, 2 filling stations. They had a number of cafes, and it was really a town where they shipped out a lot of cattle and stuff.
My dad had the ranch. We had sheep and cattle, and I remember the stockyard where the trains came through with the water tank. We had a Lutheran church, which we belonged to our whole life, and a Methodist church there. The school closed after I left, and people just moved away. The ranches all sold, so people just left.
Today, Smithwick is not the bustling cattle town it once was, but it's not entirely vanished. It still has an operating post office, and a few families still call it home.
I call such places near ghost towns because they are a shell of their former selves. They once maybe had 150 people or 200, and now they're down to maybe 50, maybe 25 people, maybe 6. It's what's happened to them as a community there. They've lost their identity. But as long as someone lives there, I think that they still have a sense of worth as a community.
The name of it was from General Manuel Bonilla from Honduras, and it literally means good village. Bonilla was a stop between Tulare and Woolsey. Passenger trains went through there, also a water stop. It was actually slated to be about 4 miles south of where it's at now, but due to the lack of water, they actually moved the town further north and further north and further north until it got to where it's presently at. There was a hotel or inn type of business. There was a post office just about from the very beginning, a lumber yard, there was a creamery, there was gas stations. At one time it was quite a thriving little community. A couple hundred people. When the railroad left, it didn't have the infrastructure to continue on. There is a church, still thriving. There's a handful of people that live there, but that's about it.
I was born and raised right beside the Norbeck town site, and I've been here for 90 plus years. I'm 90 years old plus. There's always been a Norbeck Baptist Church here ever since I can remember. When I was in the first grade, if I'm not stretching it any, got no proof of it, but I think I can remember 24 kids in the Norbeck schoolhouse of all grades.
Norbeck was named after former Governor Peter Norbeck. The post office remained in operation until 1971. Dean Gebhardt grew up near the town site and later chose to call Norbeck home when he and his wife bought their first house there.
We liked the Norbeck area and the people in the township. It was just like one big family. The trains come into Norbeck. They make their round trip twice a day. They'd come, the Milwaukee would be from Roscoe to Orient and back the same day. During the 30s, it didn't rain and people had to go where they could get labor. There was a lot of farms around. If you didn't raise any crops, you didn't have anything to sell, you didn't accumulate any money. I'm assuming that's probably why so many people left. You look around the country, everybody is on their grandpa's farm or their dad and mother's farm, but Betty and I built this up ourselves, our own labor. It's home. I'm just real proud of it.
Doug Gerlow serves as the fire chief, police chief, and mayor of the vanished town of Argonne in Minor County. Nestled in between farmland, this railroad community was once home to about 70 people.
I grew up in Argonne. Went to school there. My dad was the janitor, the bus driver, and also he farmed. Only thing left of that is the silo. The town, it went by St. Mary's, and from what little bit of history we know of, in 1920, it was kind of a boom again, and that's when a lot of the businesses were built or rebuilt, and the post office was reopened, but there was another town by the name of St. Mary's. So a government official suggested naming it Argonne after the Battle of Argonne in the First World War. And of course the bank vault's still there. Okay, behind me here was the Argonne School. Stretched kind of beyond these trees, and then farther to my right was the playground, and at the playground we had of course the slide, the swings, a merry-go-round. We were kind of known for our basketball. Some of us Argonnites always say had a big part in Howard winning the state basketball tournaments they won. You know, it's home. It's always kind of where we like to go back. It's our roots, and we know a lot of the people, and we grew up with these people, and at that time there was what we would call a community. I don't know, it was just an easy time as kids to grow up. We had to make our own games, and we played a lot of baseball and just
simple things. So.
Located in Dual County, Moritz's population never reached town proportions. But those who called Moritz home remember traveling to this railroad village to gather supplies and even enjoy outdoor movies.
My grandparents used to live about 4 miles from Moritz. I remember many times going on Saturday night to Moritz to buy groceries. That's where my grandparents usually bought their groceries. And also many times went to Moritz with my grandfather with grain in the fall of the year. It was a busy time. There was a lumber yard, grocery store, of course, and they bought cream and eggs. My father was he was a substitute mail carrier out of Eldemont. Moritz was on the mail route, and once in a while we got to ride along with my dad. And Moritz was always a favorite place to stop because we always got a treat. There was a school right north of Moritz, half a mile.
In 1956, I was asked by the Hunts if I could teach at their school. It was one room and then it had a little entry, except there was a stove in the middle of the room. And I had never started a stove like that. So Mr. Giese would come every morning in the winter and build a fire. And the piano was something. I'm not a piano player, but I can play a little bit, and I guess they hadn't had a teacher for a couple of years that could play the piano. So I played the piano and we'd sing, and they liked that. So it was just good memories. It was such a closeness. Everybody could help everybody out, and even though, like Pat said, there weren't many people right in the town, but they had neighbors that were close, and they helped one another, and it was just people were just friendly.
Today, the raised land where the railroad once traveled is all that remains, a few buildings and farmland.
The story is that one of the founders of the town, his daughter's name was Leona. And so they were going to name the town Leona, South Dakota, after his daughter. But when they sent in the application to found the town, they sent the application into the state, his handwriting looked like a Z instead of an L. And so it's Zeona.
In Perkins County sits the old village of Zeona. This small gathering spot is where local farmers and ranchers would come to worship, get supplies, and visit with neighbors.
Back in the days in the early 1900s, there were a lot of homesteaders, and so they wanted to have a church connection, and they were a Norwegian community, so that's how the Lutheran Church came about.
Oh, both of my grandparents on my dad's and my mother's side homesteaded here. Grandpa and my granddad Hathaway homesteaded 6 miles east of here in 1910. There was a store, had groceries and a post office, and they lived behind the store in the same building. I remember when they closed it, I was really disappointed because I was used to coming here and stopping all the time my whole life.
It was just a fun place to come to later in the 60s and 70s and 80s and into the early 90s, and it was really neat to come in. We'd have coffee and cookies and homemade popcorn, and my kids got to see that.
Zeona's businesses closed their doors many years ago, but the Lutheran Church remains open. Neighbors, friends, and families continue to travel far and wide to worship here, including the musically gifted Jurdy family. Their roots run deep in Perkins County, but part of the clan has spread their wings and now shares their homegrown talents with the rest of the world. The Zeona Road Band is proving you can take these ranch kids out of the country, but you'll never take the country out of these ranch kids.
We've been doing this now for, I think we started here about 4 years ago, playing around this South Dakota area. Then 2 years ago, we made the move to Nashville in part, so we're in Nashville. A little over half-time now, and then back in this area touring and doing shows.
We're actually raised on a buffalo ranch about 15 miles north of Zeona, but we grew up, 3 of us were baptized here. We went to church here. Our family, we have a lot of history of, our family grew up or homesteaded right down here, and yeah, just a lot of family history that ties us back to this area.
We're a very small congregation. When I got back from Vietnam in 1970, I walked in my first day of worship, and the church was full, probably 50 people at least. Now we're down to about 16 because the ranches are getting bigger, and young people, it's hard for them to make a living on smaller places.
We'd come over quite often to get supplies. Daddy'd send us over in the old Model A from home, and didn't have any brakes on it, but we'd get over here and get our stuff.
Rodney Carr and John Erickson both grew up around Struhl, South Dakota, which is located in Perkins County. Struhl was founded in 1908 by enterprising citizens who saw the need for a supply center to serve the region's many homesteaders. The name Struhl comes from Ben Struhl, one of the area's first homesteaders and merchants.
About 1909, the whole community came together, all the ranchers from long ways out, and built this dance hall as a community hall. And yeah, a dance in Struhl you could write home about every time.
Are you sure you want to write home?
Yeah.
Struhl's growth and prosperity waned with a declining population and advancements in transportation. By 1955, Struhl bowed to progress, and the majority of the town moved 2 miles north to what is now the small town of Prairie City. Incidentally, in the summer of 1955, Prairie City won the record as South Dakota's fastest-growing town. Western South Dakota was home to many frontier villages that popped up when settlers took advantage of the Homestead Act or waited for the railroad, except those in Harding County. The railroad never made it that far.
Harding County is kind of an anomaly. It's up in the northwest part of the state, and the railroads developed basically north, east, and south of it. But it was not developed until later, so by then the Milwaukee Railroad, which had built west of Aberdeen out to the Pacific Coast in 1909, as well as lines into Faith and Isabel to the east, just didn't need to go that far. The Chicago Northwestern had planned to build up from Belle Fourche, but once again they were trailing cattle, which was the primary commodity out of Harding County, so they were trailing those down to Belle Fourche.
Camp Crook started first, and then the next year or two Nashville got started back up the creek from Camp Crook. Around 1884 is when Nashville would have gotten started. And he had a little store there, from what I understand. It lasted for a while, and it got a post office. And then by about 1887 or thereabouts, a guy named Stokes came in and settled on a claim there where Harding sits now, and then he went and bought out the Nashville store and moved it down to his place. And then he ended up with the post office a few years after that, and his daughter ran it, as far as I can tell. The old house that Stokes built, and there was a warehouse that they had that has been converted into kind of a garage. It never was a town necessarily. Nobody ever lived there much. It was more like the hub to the community. It never was a destination, but it was always on somebody's way to a destination. So they'd be coming from the hills into the Little Missouri country or up into the Yellowstone country or wherever they were going, and that Harding was kind of in their way to get there. Teddy Roosevelt had spent quite a little bit of time on the river, not a lot, but some, over toward Camp Crook and that, and then he ended up sleeping on the floor at Macy at some time or another on his travels through, which was a roadhouse down south and east of Harding. And Harding's between the two, so evidently we had Teddy Roosevelt at some time or another, but nobody knew who he was. There's nobody left that Harding means anything to now, Anybody that ever lived there pretty much is dead, except me and my family. All the old ones they're all gone. They've still got people around, and they come by once in a while and say my grandma used to dance here or something like that, but not often. Mostly rubbernecks coming by and looking for antiques and free gasoline.
South of Harding sits the old town of Minnesela in Butte County. Minnesela also served as the county seat, but only for a short time. A well-known lawman and the railroad ensured the history of this western town would be short-lived.
Seth Bullock was a shrewd businessman, but what he was hired to do by the townspeople of Minnesela was to go and lobby the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad and its subsidiary to build to Minnesela to be the county seat of Butte County. Well, what he did is he went to Rapid City, met with the officials of the railroad, and offered them a better deal. He said, instead of paying Minnesela $50,000, why don't I give you some land on my ranch, and you can set up some stockyards and a watering place for your locomotives and everything, and I won't charge you a dime. Well, that's how Belle Fourche came to be. And Seth Bullock was not the best negotiator for Minnesela.
This once thriving county seat is now an empty field on private land, with a historical marker reminding visitors of its existence.
Dewey was out in cattle country. The railroad came through in 1890, laid the tracks, so the ranchers then had a place to bring their cattle for shipment. And the railroad stopped there. They set up corrals and bring their cattle in there and ship them by the railroad.
3 days before South Dakota became a state in 1889, the Burlington, Missouri Railroad reached the old town of Dewey in Custer County. Dewey was not always Dewey. It was known as S&G Ranch, S for Sturgis and G for Goodell, who were managers of a large open-range ranch in western Custer County and parts of Wyoming. The ranch ran as many as 10,000 head of cattle in the 1880s. The town would later be renamed Dewey after Admiral Dewey of the Spanish-American War. Dewey never had more than 14 families living inside its city limits at one time, but it was an important business district to the 1,000 plus people in the surrounding area. A few families still call Dewey home, and they've taken it upon themselves to create their own informational signs about Dewey's past. This sign tells the story of cattle ranchers riding from the west looking for the notch in the hills. Dewey sat east of the notch. When the cattle drivers spotted the notch, they knew to drive their cattle through and into Dewey, where trains were waiting, and men and women could fill up with supplies, meet old friends, and get some much-needed rest.
It actually had a post office because it was a long ways between other towns, and the need of a post office was good for mail for the ranchers. And then there was a gentleman that decided, you know, there's enough people coming and going here, I think I could set up a general store and sell merchandise, which he did. Transportation changed, and there was starting to be trucks hauling cattle, and before you know it, then trucks took over and trains dwindled away and the town dwindled away.
It was in June, and that's when a tornado hit. Just before it struck, we seen it coming from the south across the highway. And so I hollered to the wife to get into the bathroom, and we got in and got in the bathtub. Everything was just ground up sticks stuck in the ground. Well, I had a little bit of buildings left, but pretty much everything else in the town was gone.
On June 24, 2003, a supercell thunderstorm spawned a tornado over eastern South Dakota, and the small community of Manchester was leveled in a matter of minutes. Vernon Ferguson's family homesteaded near Manchester. Ferguson remembers a town that was vibrant with businesses and families long before a tornado would take it away.
They homesteaded 4 miles north of Manchester in the 1800s.
There were numerous homes and businesses, including 2 churches, the train depot, and a high school, where Grace Ingalls Dow, the sister of Laura Ingalls Wilder, is said to have taught. Many began to leave Manchester when the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad line slowed train traffic. By 1986, the railroad officially announced its intended abandonment of the railroad line. Manchester would meet its final fate on that stormy June day.
Virden was named by a wife of one of the railroad executives. She was from France. In the late 1880s, there were 3 general stores, a hotel, a livery stable, a hardware, later an elevator, post office, doctor, lumberyard, 2 banks, 3 churches. The Opera House was built in 1916, and area residents sold stock to build this for $25 a share. But the story I wanted to share with you is on the Children's Blizzard. January 12th, 1888, there was a school about 3/4 of a mile north of town that a lot of the farm kids went to. And again, the day started out, it was very warm. The storm hit middle of the day. And it was very bad very quickly. The people in town realized that the kids were stranded, these were town kids too, stranded out in the middle of nowhere. One saving grace was they were located fairly close to the railroad tracks. The school was. So there was a rescue party sent out from town with a couple of wagons, and they just followed the railroad tracks. They were still able to see that. They got to the section line close to where the school was, and they set up a rope. So one person, or some people were back at the wagons, the other ones started walking so they wouldn't get lost. They finally found the school, they tied the rope to the school. They went inside, got all the kids bundled up. The kids followed the rope back to the wagon. They were covered up with straw and blankets. They turned the wagons around and they headed back to town, and everybody was safe. The Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul are now known as the Burlington Northern, had their last passenger service in 1965. And when that stopped, a lot of the towns around here started changing.
General Hooker had a camp of prostitutes that followed his camp. And they called it Hooker's Other Camp. And then later it got shortened to Hooker's.
Hooker, South Dakota in Turner County is rumored to have been named after an enterprising group of women engaged in a certain occupation who had resided there. However, Hooker is actually named after John Hooker, a pioneer who settled in the area. Platted in February of 1894, this cattle town had much to offer its residents. The Hooker stockyards had the reputation of being the biggest shipping point for livestock handled on that division of the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, as Hooker provided a direct line to Sioux City and Chicago.
Well, there was a school and the stockyards and the elevator. It had the post office and the general store and the barber and that cream station, and then a gas pump. And then the depot was over there. Our neighbor lady told the story. You could buy a ticket here to the state fair. And you get on the train and they'd take you right into the state fairgrounds. And then that night you'd ride the train back again.
A tornado struck Hooker in 1903, destroying most of the businesses. And once the railroad pulled out, so did the families who lived there.
Firesteel was a huge coal mining community, and the carloads of coal that used to go out of Firesteel in the 20s, 30s, and 40s was probably some of the biggest coal mining the state of South Dakota has ever seen. The amount of people that used to live there, there was well over 500 people that lived in the Firesteel area, and today you go through there and there's 6 or 8. They used to have a flour mill and all your general stores and auto parts dealerships and implements and all that stuff, and it's all gone, and you can still see the bank vault.
But the town of Firesteel took it a step further and developed it into an industry. Firesteel coal was used by most of the colleges and at one time heated the state capitol building. The company, because they had a railroad, they had a branch of the Milwaukee Road serving the town, they were able to ship all this stuff out by rail car. And they operated until 1959.
Most of the region that had gold or silver mineralization, of course, attracted lots of people. And many people wanted to live close to the claims. That's the simplest reason. And they would, people who weren't digging for gold or placer mining or searching out for more mineral wealth might open a store or start some kind of other business. A saloon was one of the prominent ones. And they could start about anywhere at the back of their claims. Those weren't really towns. They were kind of little flurries that resembled towns. The towns that had some substance that still could have gone are ones that were actually established by a group of entrepreneurs who established a town company. Deadwood was established by a form of a town company. Spearfish was a town company. Custer was a town company. Back up until the 1970s and 80s, the Black Hills were filled with remnants of old towns. The area we're sitting in, the Bald Mountain, Ruby Basin mining districts, there was remnants of the town of Terry that's over the ridge. The town of Terry, of course, is named after Terry Peak, which is just at the head of the gulch here. And this area has a different type of gold than it does at the Homestake. Homestake gold is free milling, means you can crack that rock and physically get the gold out. You can see the gold. So they could pan it out if they wanted to. Here, the gold is chemically bound. You can't pan it. If you crush it, you still can't see gold. It's in the rock. But nobody really hung around too much because they couldn't get the gold. Well, in the late 1880s, they started developing smelting. They put a smelter in Deadwood, some Deadwood entrepreneurs. They put a chlorination plant in Deadwood, again, Deadwood entrepreneurs. And both chlorine exposure and heat could extract the gold from that rock, from the gold ore. And so then suddenly they became viable up here. So about 1887, you see the original Golden Reward Company formed. And they have 3 or 4 claims at the head of the gulch. And around that, as they started digging the gold ore out, people started living there. And you could say at 1887, that was part that started to be the genesis of Terry. Other mines opened up, other mining companies came in, but eventually the Golden Reward took control of all of it. This was their main site of operation. So a lot of people moved in, up to 1,200 people around 1900. 1910 was probably its height, when it was 1,200 people living in that little gulch, all living on mining claims. There was never a town plat. It was never an official town site. They just lived on the mining company's ground. They had a public school. They started a school district in 1891, elected a school board. Once the gold started showing up in the late 1880s and they could process it, to get the gold ore to Deadwood, they needed railroads because they couldn't haul it by wagon. So promptly, the Deadwood Central, again developed by Deadwood entrepreneurs, came up through the gulches and came right up the gulch and started accessing the gold mines. Then a major railroad came into Deadwood, the Fremont Elkhorn Missouri Valley, know it more modern by Chicago Northwestern, came into Deadwood, and they built a narrow gauge line out of Deadwood through Central City, up Deadwood Gulch, came up the hillsides, and they wrapped around the hillsides. As my friend Rick Mills said, it looked like a big bowl of spaghetti the way these lines came through here. From 1891, 1890 to 1918, when the town really started diminishing, you had great transportation. The Spearfish line was ripped out in 1933, so they could still catch a train to 1933.
For a short time, Terry was the home for one well-known frontier woman, but some say even her short stay wasn't short enough.
The only thing Calamity Jane has ever done for Terry is die here. Now, if the Terry people were as smart and on the ball as the Deadwood people, she'd be buried right next to us here in the Terry Cemetery, but she's not. By the time Calamity had come to the Black Hills in July 1903, She was on her last legs, physically and literally, and she knew it. She knew she was checking out, and she was kind of going on a last binge. She'd been through Deadwood drinking and begging drinks, and she'd been in Spearfish, and so one friend of mine told me that when she was in Deadwood, they got tired of seeing her because she put on, you know, it's great to see you. Hi, Clem, let's buy a drink. 2 or 3 days of that, you get a little tired of it. And so they put her on a train to Terry. And she was up here, and she checked into a hotel, the Callaway Hotel, which is on the Sanborn map of 1903. And she was here for, I think I read about a week, and died. Inflammation of the bowels. Well, the Black Hills Pioneers, some of the same folks who ran her out of Deadwood, promptly hurried up here, put her on a wagon and hauled her back to Deadwood and planted her next to Wild Bill, much to Deadwood's benefit and much to the loss of Terry. Today the wharf owns it all. They have it fenced, just no trespassing. It is their property. Someday in the distant future, when Wharf is done mining this area and it's reclaimed to their satisfaction, reclaimed to the state's satisfaction, I'm told they'll bring these fences down and it'll be open to the public again.
Spokane, located in Custer County, is also an abandoned mining town. Unlike many of the old mining towns hidden away on private property, Spokane sits in Custer State Park, and so it is open to members of the public who are up for a short hike.
There was at least 26 ghost towns listed in Custer County. Spokane is one that has most of the, when you go there you can see all the signs of where there have been old buildings and the old mine stuff there. Some places are just gone and went right back to nature, and all it is just something written on paper that the town was there. Everybody was looking for gold. It's like the family that founded Spokane. It was the Judd family, and they come west and they found this little vein in the side of a hill over here in the eastern part of the hills, and he set up a claim there. And a cold winter night, he set the rocks on his stove, and in the morning there was a puddle of silver on the stove, and they found out there was lead in this mine. More people come and they built their homes there, and before you know it was a town. And then there was a Mr. Shepherd, and he staked his claim, but he stuck his stake a little farther over where he shouldn't have. And this Mr. Cox, it was over on his side of the land, and one day Mr. Shepherd got shot with a shotgun, and it took him a while to die. But Mr. Shepherd is buried on the mine site up there, just down below where the mine was, between the mine and the town. I often think some night when it gets dark and the moon comes over the hill and it gets real quiet, you can almost hear him out there wailing.
Trojan was about 6 miles out of Lead to the west, up by the ski slopes, right on the edge of Terry Peak. And it was a small metropolitan area.
Originally called the Portland Mining Company, it would later be changed to the Trojan Mining Company. By 1934, its name would change again to the Bald Mountain Mining Company.
It was a town with its businesses, grocery stores. It had its own school, which was the last building demolished. They didn't demolish that until 2010. No, it was a major town. It was a railroad center, not only for the Black Hills railroads like the Burlington and the Chicago Northwestern, but there was spurs off of those that went out to some of these smaller towns and smaller mines that have since disappeared. And then the mine itself had quite a system of rails. But it was a major producer right up there with Homestake up until 1959. Right after it closed, there was some businessmen from Milwaukee, Wisconsin that wanted to build a tourist resort up there. And they actually did get a start with it. Going back to railroads, they took trains to 2 different sites full of tourists. I was one of those tourists and just thought that was the greatest thing in the world. They were calling it the top of the hills. And at one point, they were trying to evict any of the residents that were left because they wanted all the buildings that were any good to be used in their resort plans. But it was major plans. It only lasted about 2 years. And at that time, the town was pretty much vacant. The next inhabitants of the town of Trojan were migrants from eastern South Dakota. Many of the young folks that came out to the Black Hills from the Sioux Falls and surrounding area ended up settling in Trojan. It was the revival. It really truly was the revival of Trojan. It was thriving with all these young folks. They had bands up there. I think Red Willow was up there, Jack Kreitzer. Yeah, in the 60s and the 70s in particular, it was quite thriving with all these young folks. But the first time I found it, I kind of came in the back door. We were out running around the woods, and I had no idea really where I was. And all of a sudden, we came around the curve on this railroad grade, and here was this big, huge mill that I'd been to as a little kid when they tried to make this tourist thing. But I just kind of accidentally stumbled on it and thought, oh, wow, this is great. And then I started, after that, going up there fairly often. It was quite a place. I used to love to four-wheel drive up there. There was another mine that was first part of Wharf that they mined. It was called the Reliance Mine. And I loved prowling around in these mines. It was just a great place to explore. A lot of history, a lot of artifacts, and it was all still there. You could go out and touch it, take pictures of it, take people there and show it to them, but it's all gone.
Growing up in Spearfish, Tinton was kind of always in the background. There was a place called Tinton Road. And in high school, we used to go up Tinton Road and go do things that we probably shouldn't have done. But I've always been outdoorsy, so when I went to the woods, I went up Tinton Road. And in 1983, I went hunting with a buddy of mine, and we drove up here, and the next thing you know, we went by the town of Tinton. It was like the first time I'd seen it since, probably the early 70s. And I just thought it was great. I mean, here was a ready-made town sitting in the woods all by itself. And it was kind of mysterious and interesting all at the same time. The construction of Tinton began in November of 1902, but it didn't begin to function as a community per se until the late spring, early summer of 1903. And there was a boarding house for the bachelor miners. There were cottages for the miners that had families. There was the post office in the early days. There was a bank. There was a stagecoach that came up here 3 times a week in the early days. And it was, by the summer of 1903, it was a thriving little metropolis. It was kind of the darling of the Black Hills at that point. The highest population that I've been able to find occurred in 1928. When the Black Hills Tin Company bought out the previous owners and expanded the town, built the world's biggest tin mill, and hired approximately 200 men. The population was about 300, and there were so many people, they started boarding people in tents south of town because there wasn't any room left in the actual wooden structures for them to stay in. Tinton is stuck out in the middle of nowhere, approximately 20 miles to the nearest town of any consequence, which was basically, or is, Spearfish. The Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad twice considered laying tracks into town, but both times they declined until the mineral output from the mine would warrant or justify the $300,000 it would have taken to actually build the railroad. And as events proved, they just could never get the mine up on a paying basis, and so the railroad never ever came. Every mining community goes through the boom-bust cycle, and a lot of times it's more than once. But Tinton's long, slow fade began in August of 1944 when it lost its government contract to supply lithium hydride to the Signal Corps for America's war effort. When they lost that contract, they closed the mill, and then they had no place to sell their product to. The final end came in November of 1953 when the Bald Mountain Mining Company leased the mill and mining operation here at Tinton, and the mill burned down. And with the mill burning down, that was kind of it. Within 2 years, the post office was abandoned, and the last person to leave Tinton as a full-time resident did so in 1960. As far as a functioning community, it's long since gone, and so are the people who made it a special place. And in their absence, I think the gap or the distance between the past and the future has been widening with each passing day. As far as I'm concerned, Tinton is still the best example of a ghost town in the Black Hills region. And the term ghost town is alluring all by itself. Now, once you start looking at photographs of how it used to be, maybe 100 years ago or 120 years ago, interest picks up in most people. The last step in this process is to actually visit it. And it doesn't take too much imagination once you visit a ghost town to get a sense of what it must have been like. It's like putting together a century-old jigsaw puzzle that explains the past. You put enough pieces together, it becomes obvious, at least to me, that Tinton isn't a ghost town. It's a place where history comes alive and the past becomes real.
Today, Tinton sits on private property. South Dakota is full of history, some well documented and handed down from generation to generation. Other history is loosely remembered with very little documentation. Taking the time to explore our state and record our stories can help preserve the past for future generations.
Everybody finds some kind of a personal connection to history that gets really interested in it. People that get a little bit on in life generally get interested in their past. They'll say get interested in history. Or they have a personal connection. Their family's from a certain area and they start getting interested in that area. I got fascinated by human endeavor. People are up here establishing towns, living in wilderness areas, seeking wealth. Partly it's about human greed, partly it's about the human drive for improvement, it's partly about transforming the landscape as we see it today. That all happened. So that drew me in.
Everything is vanishing so quickly today, far more rapidly in the last 20 or 30 years than in the previous, say, 40 years. It's important. If you want a record of any sort, you better do it now. While we preserve the past, we'll do our very best, and that's what all historians do, and hopefully there'll be a continued interest in the past. Without a past, there isn't much of a future.
To watch this or other South Dakota Public Broadcasting programs, go to watch.sdpb.org.